G'day everyone, I'm Chris Bombolis, your MC for the last of our Work Well Speaker series presentations. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land from which this recording is made, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this from their homes or workplaces. A little bit of housekeeping. You can make this presentation full screen by selecting the 4 small arrows next to the volume bar at the bottom of your screen. If that doesn't work, contact us via the chat box or via events@oar.qld.gov.au. If you have any questions for our presenter Peter, please type them into the chat box at any point. Please also note that the advice shared in this recording is general in nature and does not consider your individual circumstances. This presentation exists purely for educational purposes and should not be relied upon to make decisions in your workplace. I'm now pleased to officially introduce you to today's speaker, Peter Aspinall. Peter brings over 20 years of practical experience in occupational hygiene and allied health roles across Australia and New Zealand. His career spans both consulting and corporate hygiene roles in diverse sectors, including mining, oil and gas, public health, defence, construction, manufacturing, and various levels of government. Pete's extensive background equips him to deliver comprehensive health risk assessments, exposure control guidance, and robust support for health and hygiene management programs. He holds certificates as a certified occupational hygienist with the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and is a full member of the New Zealand Occupational Hygiene Society. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you. I am looking forward to presenting this, and I'm wanting to caveat a little bit saying that this is a planned conversation around managing airborne contaminants in the workplace. There are a lot of contaminants, and I'm going to touch on a few as we go through. So, thank you for that introduction. I'm currently working with WSP, an engineering consulting company. We do a large amount of work with various industries, various groups across the board. One of the things that I'm very conscious of is being future ready and trying to identify the hazards that may occur in the workplace, and that lines up very well with WSP's plans for developing and guiding their clients through the business of identifying hazards, looking at where we're going. The next slide, there we go. So when I got asked to present on managing airborne contaminants in the workplace, I thought there's 3 things I need to get you to take away from this presentation today. There's a lot of variance out there. Just those slides there just showing some of the different jobs that, as occupational hygienists, I come across, some of the different hazards that exist in the workplace, from asbestos, from just general dust, to fumes, to dusts from silica, and then welding. But the key things I want you to take away from this presentation are what it means with some of the changes that are occurring to workplace exposure limits that have come out from Safe Work Australia. What needs to be done in your workplace? How can you control some of these things, and what should you be aware of? And then also what you need to help manage and ensure those compliances, and how you're actually demonstrating that you're actually compliant in the workplace. So they're the 3 things I'm going to get you to take away. So if you're sitting there doing your emails on the side, catching up on a couple of reports that you haven't got done yet, they're the things I want you to take away from this today. So what is an occupational hygienist? So the science of occupational hygiene has been determined as a science and an art of identifying and understanding how humans are interfacing with the work and the environment. We use the 4 main pillars of anticipating, recognising, controlling and evaluating the workplace to have a really good understanding of where and how we should be addressing concerns in the workplace, particularly now focusing on airborne contaminants. A large amount of what we do is working with the safety teams. We identify and assist with safety hazards as well, but we're routinely called in to quantify the health risks that may exist in the workplace. It can be quite complicated, and it can be quite deterring of businesses to engage a hygienist, but I'm hoping by the end of today I'll get you to understand some of the principles of it to make it actually quite a simple process. But that's kind of the process we go through. We're looking at basic identification, exposure assessments, and then trying to work out the controls, what we need to gather for more information, and then reassessments. But watch this space. That's the general idea of what we're trying to get across to the industries and the people that we work with, but it doesn't need to be like that. What I want you to take away today is that hygienists are like you going to your GP. Okay, so we as hygienists conduct basic risk assessments like your doctor would conduct a basic health assessment. You go and see them. We do histories. We take histories, we try and identify what's been happening, what's going on, just like your doctor will have a chat to you about your blood pressure, your family histories and such. We identify the site issues on site. We conduct further investigations sometimes. We might go and take some basic measurements. Just like your doctor will arrange for some maybe initial consultation, some arrange for some health testing. We monitor the sites. So we'll go in, we'll take field samples, we'll take airborne samples, and we'll talk to that a bit more today. And a lot of what we do is personal sampling, identifying what individual risks are in the workplace. Just like your doctor, you go to your GP, they'll take some blood tests, they'll maybe prescribe some medications, and they'll do immunisations. We do some of that basic work and provide some answers. We'll give you recommendations, just like your doctor will give you recommendations for a health management plan. We might give recommendations for controlling the hazard. What hygienists are really good at doing is actually knowing when to refer on to others. We might need to engage in with the acoustics teams, the ergonomics teams, your ventilation engineers, and your occupational physicians. Just like your GP will often go, you know what, that's out of my ballpark, I'm going to refer that on to somebody else. When you might need a hygienist is a little bit different. Okay, so there are legal requirements that you need to conduct an exposure monitoring under legislation when there is an uncertainty based on reasonable grounds that an exposure standard may be exceeded. And monitoring is really necessary when they need to determine if there's a risk to health. Health surveillance is very different. All right, so we're talking monitoring as opposed to health surveillance. Health surveillance must be provided to a worker if there is a significant risk. So how do you know if you have a significant risk? You get a hygienist in, or you do some monitoring yourself to determine what that risk is. Hygienists coordinate with the occupational physicians and work you through those health surveillance issues if you need to. Under those legislative requirements, the main one we're talking about today, which is relevant, is the airborne contaminants, managing the risk of airborne contaminants, Division 7. Section 49 says, ensuring the exposure standards for substance need not be exposed. No person in the workspace should be exposed to a product or a substance that is exceeding the exposure standard that's relevant for that substance mixture. Okay, so in that image there on the right, you don't need to be an occupational hygienist or a specialist or an expert to know that that is not a workplace that's under control. That doesn't have a really good indication of control of the dust in that workplace. You don't need to be a specialist. That's something that you should be looking at, that going, we probably need to do something more here and control it. Manage it, start working on that control, and then maybe suggesting coming in with some monitoring to prove that that control is effective. With those exposure standards, so if you need to prove that you're not exceeding exposure standards, you do need to be aware that those exposure standards have actually changed, and this year they have changed. This has been coming for a while. The Safe Work Australia industry body went back to the market in 2019, just before COVID, so we're talking a while ago now, and full disclosure, WSP helped with a few of us to review a large number of those chemicals at the time. As of 2024, April, those changes are made, and so what used to be called workplace exposure standards are now called workplace exposure limits. Change in name, but there are also a number of changes that are occurring. Those values and the new values are still in a transition period until the end of November in 2026, but Slipped in amongst all of that at the same time was the welding fumes exposure standard, which was changed in January 2024. That is now implemented and that should be being complied with. I'll talk more to that point in a minute. So also associated with this at the moment, there's still 9 chemicals out there of compounds of concern that they're working through and the businesses need to be aware of. If you have these chemicals, these 9 chemicals on the screen at the moment, you do need to be aware that these are potentially going to be changing, and they haven't been allocated as changing it. So you need to go and have a look at what those changes are likely to be, but what does that mean to your workplace? The reason being, and why I'm highlighting this point at the moment, is there's a particular couple here. So when we're talking atmospheric contaminants, we're talking gases as well as particulates and dusts. These gases are particular ones of concern that are quite often used in industry or commonly measured in industry. And these are ones that I have done multiple days of monitoring over the years on a regular basis. So these are ones that I've identified and flagged particularly of concern. Chlorine, hydrogen sulfide, and the nitrogen dioxide values there that have got the highlight yellow, that indicates to me quite a lot that those potential ones will actually have some impact in the workplace. The health impacts that they're trying to protect against are against eye irritation, respiratory irritation for most of those chemicals. The ones that aren't highlighted, carbon monoxide, ammonia, nitric oxides and sulfur dioxides, they have officially changed. So they have been implemented and they will be those values within 2 years. So you should be working towards those values now. What does that mean? Okay, so there's a lot of information in that slide, and I get that. But what we're trying to get across is that you need to be prepared that those changes will impact on how your workplaces are managed and what you're doing in the workplace. What do you need to know what those exposures are? There's a legal requirement, as we've discussed. You should not be exceeding those values. The guidance is important to help you identify where those risks are. So if you're out there measuring and you've been using chemical sensors and monitoring for gases for a while, you do need to be understanding what those risks are, and you understand that you may have that risk on site. It's really important that those guidance values and those workplace exposure standards, which are now going to be called WELS, are giving you an indication of whether your controls are effective. So do you need to be maybe putting further controls in at this stage, or maybe budgeting to put in further controls like a new extraction system or things like that? Standardising those values is making it really easy to compare those values across different industries and groups. Got to keep in mind, though, however, that these values don't represent a purely safe or not safe level. Right, so it's an indication of where most people should not be having any experiences or any sort of irritation factors coming through. The aim of all of these exposure standards is still to be able to be less than that value and as low as reasonably practical. Okay, so there's a heap of more information available for those sorts of statements in that guidance and interpretation of workplace exposure standards from Safe Work Australia. So that came out, and it's been recently updated only like last month as well. So it's worth going back and having a look at that and understanding what that document's trying to do. A couple of terms I want to throw at you at the moment, which are really important when we start talking atmospheric contaminants. We're talking a time-weighted average, okay? So time-weighted average is based on 8 hours. Be aware that you will need to adjust that for longer shifts. So if you have your staff and you have people in your workplace doing 12-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts, you should be trying to pare back that time-weighted average value so that you are not exceeding the adjusted shift values as well. STEL is a short-term exposure limit, 15-minute. You shouldn't be having any more than 4 excursions in the day. So if you do have little peaks of gases coming through or materials coming through, that's okay. But we need to manage that and be aware how many times that's occurring. And peaks, obviously, you don't want to be exceeding any peaks. That's another important one that can be measured using real-time instruments, and that's probably the benefits of having a real-time instrument to know if you're hitting and exceeding those values. Under legislation and under the guidance and information that comes through, it's also really important to understand if your processes are under control. Because yes, you might not be exceeding a TWA, but if you're doing that, or if you're doing it for a short period of time only, do that more than 3 times in an 8-hour period, and your process is not under control. in a single time, if you have a value that is exceeding 5 times the TWA, you really should be looking at how you are managing that exposure in the workplace and being aware of it. So what this is trying to, I guess, put across is, how do you know if these are occurring? Are you measuring it? Are you determining if this is an issue? And one thing also, just quickly on this slide, it's important to understand that with these changes that are coming, if you are not careful and you're not monitoring this and watching this and aware of this, you could potentially be actually demonstrating that your processes are not under control, even though your alarms and your instruments are not exceeding the current values, particularly looking at hydrogen sulfide, nitrogen dioxide. You've only got to start hitting a peak of 5 ppm and you are exceeding 5 times the TWA. So it's really important with the lowering of some of these values out there that this is going to impact on how people are seen to be controlling hazards in their workplace. So when we talk about monitoring, there's safety monitoring and then there's hygiene monitoring. I'm going to talk mostly about hygiene monitoring initially, and we'll touch on safety monitoring in a minute. But hygiene monitoring is very much comparing the exposure of a worker to a known exposure standard that's out there. And when we are obtaining that data, we really need to make sure we're capturing that result from within the worker's breathing zone. And as you can see, that's that 30 centimetre, 300 millimetre hemisphere around the worker's breathing zone, their mouth. And that's where we need to be obtaining the data from. I don't particularly care if your boots are getting dusty or getting exposed to gas. I want to know what is in the breathing zone of the worker. And one of these that I'm going to touch on, just to give a really good example, is welding hazards. Now, welding is really important, as I mentioned earlier. Welding has changed. It's gone from 5 milligrams a cubic metre of welding fumes down to 1 milligram a cubic metre for a time-weighted average. All right, so that's a significant reduction. That's just general welding fumes. That's not taking into account the particular metals within that welding fume as well. And it's really important that you understand that you should be doing this now and assessing your workplace to these values now. You do need to be undertaking some risk assessments on site. You do need to make sure you've got a monitoring program set up to prove or disprove that where you're at. You do need to be reviewing your controls. Do we need to maybe capture more of the fumes that are coming off the welding tasks? Education and training is really critical for your staff, particularly if you're making them now wear respiratory protection. So making sure that your staff are aware of what the hazards are, what they need to do to manage and control it, even to the point of making sure that they actually go and turn on the extraction system before they go and do a job. So it's education and training, and the RPE, obviously, from the hierarchy or controls, it's important that they're trained and it's the most appropriate respiratory protection for that work as well. Why is this important? Because health effects from welding have been well documented. The route of entry for those is not just respiratory system, but there is a small amount that can be absorbed through the skin and through the eyes as well. So good protection is important. There are acute and chronic effects associated with welding fumes. There are welders that will have immediate effects, often known as welding fume fever, that people go home at the end of the day and feel uncomfortable, feel like they've got the flu coming. And then the chronic exposures. Historically, some of the old school methods that were used to manage this, which aren't appropriate obviously, where they used to encourage the welders to drink milk before they went home, or when they get home to drink lots of milk to absorb the material that they've been exposed to throughout the day. Obviously that is definitely not advocated anymore. The other critical factor that we do need to make everyone aware of is that it is a confirmed carcinogen. Welding fumes have been demonstrated that they will cause cancer. All right? So anytime we have that time of a hazard in the workplace, we must be keeping those exposures to as low as reasonably practicable. Okay, that's why it's been reduced five times. And as I mentioned before, not just the welding fumes, you do need to know what some of the various metal exposures are as well going forward. And it's a complicated process. I get it. You got various consumables, different welding rods. The shield gases themselves complicate the process. You may be using fluxes, and then you have different temperatures that will change the way metals respond. Those contaminants that also come from the painted surfaces or the materials that are actually on the products that are being welded, they all contribute to that overall risk. And that's why understanding some of the fumes is not just the particulate side, but also understanding some of the organic compounds, that some of the volatiles that are coming off this process as well. Those processes, the process involved, they all vary so greatly that it's really important to have a look at that. And as most people, if you have a welding team in your workplace, it's not just the welding fumes, there's also grinding dust, because there's not many welders out there that don't do a bit of grinding at the same time, unless they're your world's best welder. Current controls are really important. Now, I'm seeing this much, much more frequently in the market now, and with our clients. Powered air purifying respirators, the PAPRs, are being widely accepted now as the go-to respiratory protection for the welders themselves. There's various different styles out there. There's some that sit on the back of the neck, as in the image there, or sit behind. It's really important that we understand that the workers are trained, that they put it on and they wear it appropriately, and that they're wearing it for a good length of time as well. But also now, with that lowering of that exposure standard in the workshop, it is really important that you start identifying and looking at the others in the workplace that may be potentially impacted by those welding fumes. What about the mechanic in the workshop area next door? What about the trade assistant who's helping the welder? Are they getting exposed to the fumes? It's really important that we be looking at that. And again, understanding what the exposure levels are really important to making sure that your respiratory protection is actually giving you a level of protection that's required. Going back to hierarchy controls, this is something I'm seeing a lot more being looked at and brought on and being considered and trialled, and it's the on-tool extraction. Right. Now, some of the old school or people that have got welders in their team will have people jumping up and down saying, no, it's not going to work, it takes the gases away. Just going to show this video and get it rolling through. I'll talk to it in a second once it starts. The benefit of having the on-tool extraction is that you get the fumes captured at the source. Now, this welder who's trialling some new equipment, the on-tool extraction is rotating through. So initially it's off, it gets turned on, and you'll see a reduction in the fumes right in front of his face. And then it'll come back on again just before he stops. And then the fumes are coming back in there. So you can see quite a significant difference. Now, interestingly enough, when the worker lifts his hood, he does have the respirator protection while the hood is down. But again, he steps back from the workplace, and the first thing he does is he lifts his hood up. We're kind of recommending that you want to be leaving that a little bit longer in place so that you are still getting that protection as you're stepping away from the actual job. Because as you can see, those fumes are still lingering in that workplace. So these things need to be looked at, and you need to be considering these moving forward. We're not going to touch too much on dust, but as I mentioned before, dust is a big component of the airborne contaminants. It's important that you understand if you have a dusty workplace, there's a lot of information that's out there now. I don't think anybody can say that they haven't heard that silica is a big concern at the moment. There are a whole heap of new tools. There's some resources available now through the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists at that silica resource. It's important that you go and have a look and see what information is there. But a large amount of what we're doing here is validating whether the controls that you've got in place are working. So the personal monitoring we do, so that worker there in that image is wearing a pump on his belt, and he's wearing a filter media capture point in a cyclone up around his chin, which you can't see. But we are sampling for his personal exposures given the task that he's doing. It's really important that we look at that, monitor the levels of contaminations to work out whether the controls are effective in that workplace. Touching on safety monitoring now, I'm just going to very quickly look at a couple of points here. Safety monitoring is an important part of the process too. Now, we should not be really directly reporting and comparing the results that we get from safety monitoring unless it's been captured from within the breathing zone, as we mentioned before. But the benefits of safety monitoring for like a real-time perspective, particularly when we're talking gases in the environment, is that it is really handy for determining the effectiveness of controls and being able to manage and change controls in a timely manner. When you start looking at data from real-time instruments, there's a lot of data. Okay, a lot of data is quite boring. Okay, that data is hard to chew through, so you need to have some instruments that'll have an alarm that give you an indication of where things are. And understanding where and what's going on when those sorts of data points are happening is critical. So that graph is over only a couple of minutes, but it's very quickly to show how changes can occur. Being aware of what your data is doing and the data information that's being captured and stored and available for review at a later time is critical. So just because you may have some peak values occurring in the workplace doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have an exceedance of a time-weighted average. Your peak may be high, but we're hoping to identify where that peak is occurring. Although, with some of the new exposure standards, those peaks now and those STEL, the short-term exposure limits, are going to be getting and being tipped over quite quickly. So that example is a sulfur dioxide gas monitor. Over a couple of minutes, we had a peak of nearly 50 ppm, and we can see a corresponding change in the STEL. So that information is available from your instruments, and you need to talk to your suppliers and the equipment suppliers to understand how much information you can get out of these things. Here's a slide I used earlier this year for a conference in Perth that I attended for the mining industry, particularly for the mining groups. I don't know if there's many mining people on this call, but it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. Hydrogen sulfide is a very common gas that's monitored pretty much in any confined space, but certainly it's a chemical of concern or a gas of concern. Currently, most instruments on the market will set their alarms at 50% of the time-weighted average to give you an indication that we've got time and we need to get out and stop what you're doing. And so that's 5 ppm at the moment. Okay, if you have an alarm get to 10 ppm, that's normally where most instruments will go into lockdown alarm, and you won't be able to do anything until you've extracted yourself from the area. Okay, with the new wells, in keeping with that model, those alarm points are now going to be down to 0.5 of a ppm. Or 1 ppm. Okay, so that's a 10-fold reduction in the value. So those alarms are going to be going off at 0.5 of a ppm for H2S. So if you have a H2S gas monitor in your workplace, understanding what your alarm levels are set for is really going to be critical to working through that with your teams. Right? What's it going to mean for you that if you have to start stopping work at 1 ppm alarms? You need to go and have those conversations, identify where that condition may occur in the workplace. Look at some daily monitoring of tasks, go and actually understanding how frequently are these tasks occurring. We're doing some work currently for a water provider that has looking at the H2S, ammonia and some chlorine exposures over time. It's interesting when we start looking at that, we get subjective comments that it's happening all the time, we're getting alarms all the time, but the monitoring we've indicated is actually quite good, and it's showing that the time-weighted averages are not getting exceeded. However, we're certainly getting some peak performances. So understanding and then where we can control that is vital. It's going to be important that people understand what this is going to mean for your industry groups, that whether you're going to have to just comply with the levels that are being detected and go back and visit your go and no-go alarms. It's going to mean that we're going to educate workers around what it means if that alarm is going off. For people that want to get more into that, and I'm quite passionate about that little section, there's some great information, some really great resources available through the American Institute of Hygiene Association. American Industrial Hygienists Association. So there's some information there. Go and have a look at that, or get in touch with the appropriate people to work through those programs. And generally across the board, when we start talking airborne contaminants, there's lots of things that you can do just for your basic workplace. Go and identify any historical data that you may have. If you've started new as the safety manager for a business, go and have a look and see if there's any monitoring that's been done. Understand what your process flows are. Where are your pinch points that may have a release of a contaminant into the atmosphere? Go and have a look at your SDSs. Get the information from them very quickly. If you're seeing those symbols, those pictograms that are occurring on your SDSs, that's a chemical you might want to have an understanding about, because there's a good chance that that will have an exposure standard and will be something that you need to manage in the workplace. Talk to your workers. Are there odours? Are there concerns about dust in particular areas? Look at that. And then quantify those so that you can compare it back to a standard, compare it back to those exposure standards that are existing. Go and talk to your engineers on site. What can we do to make this different? Have a talk to your laboratory staff. They're the important places that you're going to need to look at. If you have a process that's under control, that's great, but go and check out your laboratory staff to make sure that they're being protected just as much. And generally across the board, when you start talking controls around atmospheric hazards, it's important that you get those consultation with the workers. Get it formalised, go through that process. If you don't know or you're not sure where to start, get a hygienist in to come and help. It's like go and see the GP. Get someone in to come and help and have that initial conversation, and if they need to refer you on to someone else, they'll do that. Update and improve your controls, then correct the equipment and manage it and validate those levels. It's really critical to know and have that documented somewhere that you have actually done that risk assessment and that you have taken some measurements, and this is what there was the conditions at the time and this is what we found. Educate and train your workers. I can't stress that enough at the moment with regards to the hazards themselves. Make them aware of what those hazards are and what the controls are that are critical to managing those hazards in the workplace. Go back and review and change all those changes. Make sure those new controls are implemented and then monitor again. It's like going to your GP and getting a checkup again. Go back for that follow-up visit. Go hear what your results were. Go find out what you need to do next. So that complicated program that I mentioned earlier, all those things, a large amount of what we're trying to do is take you from having an unacceptable exposure or not knowing what your exposures are, so basically characterising to know what those hazards are. The hygienist or you yourself can go through that, do that assessment process to really understand and take it down. So to simplify all of that busy little slide, the whole aim of having a hygiene program is to take what at the start might be uncertain. We don't know what our risks are, we don't know what our levels are, and work that through and reduce those levels of the different chemicals and the different gases and different atmospheric contaminants that exist, and get to a point where you have an understanding of all the acceptable results. So again, going back, just put down your email for a second, have a look at this. What does it mean in the workplace exposures? Make sure you're aware that those changes have occurred and you go and find that information. Make sure that you understand what needs to be done in your workplace and address those hazards, and then what you need to manage and comply with that from a healthy workplace point of view. So thank you for the opportunity to present this to the team today.
Thanks, Andrew. If you'd like to join me over here, that'd be great. We do have time for questions. And remember, if you do have a question, please use them, submit them via the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to start the ball rolling, one for me, and you've mentioned this twice at the beginning and at the end of your presentation. The three key areas: recognise, control and evaluate. To me, that sounds like this is a fluid process and you need to stay on top of it all the time.
Simple answer to that is yes, 100%. It should be a program that is reviewed on a regular basis. You can't just stop and think that it's happening and then it means going back out there and checking that those controls are actually being used. So, yeah, it's an ongoing process, 100%. I'm glad that you took that part away.
Yeah, and how important is it? I mean, is this the core of what we're saying here to provide protection, safety in the workplace?
I'm a very practical hygienist, so I think my takeaway is that it drills down to, at the end of the day, if you have a hazard in the workplace, know what it is, know how to control it, what your controls are, and then go back and prove that those controls are effective. It comes down to as simple as that. It gets complicated when you start to try and measure and get involved in it. That's the key point. Yeah.
All right. Questions from our viewers now. From Greg: for silica monitoring, can an employer put personal monitors on workers and be considered acceptable by WHSQ, or is monitoring by a practicing hygienist preferred?
That is a great question. Under the legislation and the code of practice, there is requirements that a certified hygienist should be involved in the process for determining the groups and the SEGs we call, so the similar exposure groups, so identifying the right people to put the monitoring on. To a large extent, it is not as simple as I'm trying to make it out to be. However, yes, they should have a hygienist get involved at some stage so you know you've got the right people, you've got the right amount of time being monitored, you've got the right equipment to monitor that process. But once that's done, and if you have the skills in the workplace, you can then engage with a hygienist, and most hygienists will work you through that, upskill and train your staff if that's what you've got, to do some ongoing monitoring. But in reality, you definitely need to have a hygienist involved in the process, at least for initial phases of it.
Okay, from Shirley, thanks for joining us, Shirley. Do you also validate mechanical ventilation?
100% yes. Definitely needs to validate it. So is it turned on? Is it a simple validation process? What are the flow rates? Is that flow rate appropriate for the material that you're trying to capture and trying to remove from the workplace? You know, certain flow rates will be required, whether it's a fume over a dust material. So yeah, definitely need to validate that, and that should be done regularly. We don't have the legislative timeframes that say you must do it so within certain timeframes, but certainly needs to be demonstrated that's being done. Yep.
I know for Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, the silica industry is a priority industry and one they're concentrating on. And we have a question from Lisa. She'd like to know, is there a device to monitor silica levels yourself on site?
Yes, there are multiple different instruments out there. Silica itself is hard to speciate from general dusts. My position on this is that if you have any dust in the workplace, you should be managing it appropriately. So you want to protect the workers from any dust. I think certainly to speciate just the silica content starts getting more complicated, and you may need more technical equipment to break it down to determine the silica content. There are instruments out there that will give you a real-time indication and then assume that 5% or 10%, whatever you set into the instrument, is silica content, and they can work around that. However, it's like anything, it's understanding the quality and the limitations of that equipment that's out there. So that's where you really want to have good conversations with the equipment suppliers. Don't just hire somebody and think that's done and dusted. Have those conversations with the suppliers and get engaged with a hygienist or a specialist in that area.
Again, for the uninitiated like myself, when you're talking about dust, are you talking about dust, as in, you know, the stuff that accumulates over time, or are we talking about, dust from materials or from minerals or whatever?
Yeah. Okay. So, good question. Good question.
What is dust? Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. Look, my feeling is any dust is not good dust. You don't want to be breathing in significant amounts of any dust, whether that be just routine street dusts. When we start talking about dust, we start looking at the quantity, the sizing, the fraction of the dust materials. When we talk particularly about silica, we're looking at the respirable fraction, which gets deep into the lungs. Your body's an amazing thing. Your body will take out a lot of the dust through your nose, and you'll blow it out in the toilet or in the showers when you get home at night. You know, that's what your body's doing, and it's doing it every day. But it's important to understand what the makeup of some dusts are. You don't certainly want to be exposed to asbestos dust. You want to make sure that you understand what the breakdown is. Talcum powders and other things like that, maybe they're grain dusts and stuff. All of those have got potential for causing lung disease at the end of the day.
Okay, that's very interesting. A question from Brad. What type of RPE would you recommend for protecting against welding fumes and gases, and when should it be used?
Thank you, Brad. As I showed in a couple of my slides, I think it's really important that the RPE that's worn is appropriate. The filters themselves is critical. As you saw in that fume, there was fumes coming up. That's a particulate filter requirement, so minimum of a P2 because it's a thermally generated fume. But you also will have different gases coming off the welding process. So organic vapor cartridges are a critical component as well. So you get a combined filter that has both together is the filter of choice when we're talking welding. And as to the question about when to wear it, ideally you wear it from the start to the finish of the job. And as we showed in that video, it's important that you don't quickly just take off your particularly the positive air pressure ones that have that airflow that's coming in place. It's critical that that's worn until the job's completed and then maybe taken away, wiped over and put away safely as well.
I see lots and lots of questions coming in. If you do have a question for Pete, remember, please submit them via the chat box. The team are busily going through them and we'll get to as many as we can. This one comes from Cindy. She'd like to know, how concerned should we be regarding synthetic mineral fibres without any exposure limits? For example, acute exposure of office staff due to degrading HVAC insulation and prolonged exposure by facility staff. Should these be treated like asbestos? Big question.
That is a really good question, and that's certainly not a simple answer. And the reason is, and I say this a lot in occupational hygiene, it depends. Volumes, exposure over time, duration, all those things are critical to understand before you can really give an idea of whether you should be concerned. However, like anything, you want to be keeping those exposures to as low as reasonably practical. So my simple answer to that kind of detailed question would be I would be getting some assistance in to have a look and doing a formal risk assessment of that and understanding it.
So you're talking about perhaps getting in an expert to help you, even if it's ease of mind, get through this?
One of the biggest problems we have in the workplace is the unknown, and people get stressed about what they don't know or not are comfortable with. And that's what I guess that last slide was trying to show, was we want to take you from having an uncertainty of the hazards in the workplace to a place where you know that the levels are acceptable and that no one's going to go home unwell at the end of the workplace.
This one's from Tracy. Can monitoring equipment monitor various levels for workers, for example, dust, fumes, oxygen monitoring, etc.? And can these be monitored remotely by those in a control centre, for example? And does it need to be attached to the worker, or can it be within the work site itself? Again, another complex question, but one that's really worth delving into.
100%. Look, this is an area I've got a bit of passion for. Simple answer is yes, Tracy. It depends on your budget. But yes, you can do pretty much all of what you're looking for. Can it be monitored remotely? There is newer and greater equipment now, the Bluetooths, they talk to each other. If one alarm goes off, it notifies the supervisor in another area. There's some brilliant equipment out there, and I really suggest you go and see those suppliers of those equipment, get them to bring out some examples, trial it with you, see what's going to work for your workplace, and try that material, those products, or those pieces of equipment in the workplace. But yeah, just to the point around the oxygen and the other bits and pieces, there's not an instrument out there that I'm aware that will do everything. It doesn't exist, you know. But there are multiple different instruments that will do different measurements over different times and to different capacities. So yes, you can do exactly all those things that you're looking for. It's just going to depend on how much and how often, and I guess putting it into some context of risk. Yeah.
I'll have a follow-up to Tracy's question then. Is there room then for app builders, you know, those who have that creative genius to come up with some things that may help on the technological side of things?
Absolutely. There's opportunities galore. There's companies out there, there's people that I've spoken with over the years that are trying to demonstrate how people are getting exposed and when they're getting exposed and what tasks they're doing when that occurs. There's equipment out there that will go back to a central location and flag up on a control board monitor that the worker in one part of the plant has had some exposure and maybe we should go and check on what's going on in that part of the plant. So yeah, there's lots of information out there. Apps are obviously everywhere, whether you can use phones at all the times, but getting that communication loop is really critical. All that data is forming that understanding of what the hazards are in that workplace.
I want to ask you again a question without notice from me. What do you say then to the operation that says, oh, we're just a small family company or a medium little company and we don't have the budget to do this, even though we are concerned for our workers?
Yeah, there's lots of free resources out there. I put a couple up on display, and I'm sure we can probably add a few extra to the chat. But there's a lot of free information out there. The OIR website has heaps of information of how you can manage some of these things. There's lots of information available through the Australian Institute of Hygienists, through the Safe Work Australia locations. So there is a lot of information out there. When it comes to the monitoring and some of that actual quantification of the risks, I would much rather you spend your money on the controls and implementing controls that you know are going to work. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that an area is dusty, we've got build-up of materials on ledges, it's not being controlled. So those sorts of visual clues are just as important as going out there and sampling and causing, spending some money on monitoring programs. So certainly visual clues are just as important. Get it fixed up, and then if you're still not quite sure if it's good enough, that's when you maybe start talking to other industry bodies, go in with a couple of other consultants or a couple of other, similar work groups in your industry, and join it together and spend this money that way.
Yep. Here's one from Zach. Is there a standard for exposure levels for lead dust and working around this when undertaking refurbishment works?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I think it might be the Zach I know. But look, from a lead perspective, there is an airborne lead exposure standard. Yes, there is. Is there one for lead dust? Not particularly. It's important that is discussed if you're finding lead dust on a particular surface, that is discussed around what your risks are in your workplace and who's interacting with that material. But yet there is an exposure standard for lead dust in atmosphere, again, measured in the breathing zone. Now, there's quite a lot of examples, and I will be honest, I've monitored for lead in the air before and not found a lot. It tends to land on the surfaces and settle pretty quickly. So there are other requirements, and lead is another one of those, one that's in legislation, like asbestos. It has its own guidance in there that talks about a lead process, so you need to understand that. And from that, you may actually need to do blood testing with your workers, because lead's not only absorbed in through, breathed in through the lungs, it's also absorbed through skin or ingestion. So it's important that you're covering off on those exposure risks as well.
Pete, the good news for you is the questions keep rolling in. This one's from Maddie. Is real-time monitoring for coal dust constantly a recommendation? On top of already having a baseline program, scheduled monitoring as per SEGs and doing more than the required numbers, and investigative monitoring when required, of course.
Okay, that's a good question. Simple answer is there's different legislations for different work areas. So we're talking coal dust. Possibly you're going to need to be looking at the coal mining regulations. So they are quite different to the normal regs, but they're based around the same sort of values. So there are some specific requirements, I think, that you're getting at from that, that you'll need to make sure you're complying with, from how frequently you need to do it. Generally, you look at how those similar exposure groups, the SEGs that you mentioned, where they sit in the scheme of the compared to the exposure standard, and understand that if they're regularly hitting 50% exposure standards, then you may need to increase the amount of monitoring that you're doing for those workers. If you're only down at 10%, you might be only just be able to reduce that monitoring back. There's a lot of guidance out there. There's some specific requirements that need to be complied with as well. So that's another one that has definite requirements for a certified occupational hygienist to be involved in. So yeah, have a look at that. But yeah, that's a loaded question. But yes.
Here's one from Andrew. For workers where tight-fitting RPE is not suitable, i.e. those unshaven, but loose-fitting PAPRs are not appropriate to their role, say sales staff, what would you recommend as a good level of control?
Okay, so if you're relying on PPE or RPE, you really need to be managing that control better. Why are your sales staff getting exposed to dust? I'd be starting at that question. If it means that you need to be scaling it back to higher order controls in a workshop environment, certainly extraction would be first port of call, so that you can actually demonstrate that we don't have a dust problem, we don't need to wear respiratory protection. So you can, obviously wear respirators for nuisance dust levels, to stop people, sneezing and causing problems that way. But we're particularly focused on, exceedances of the exposure standards. However, the requirement would be very much to look at the higher order controls, minimise the dust generation at that point. Before we start just throwing PPE at it. One of the best things that's come out of the focus on the clean shave policy, while it's difficult to police and manage in the workplace, I get it, the practicalities of it are difficult. It is encouraging and it is really driving industry groups to look at the higher order controls to minimise the dust generation or to capture the dust at the source.
Here's one from Mel. Should a metal recycling centre that deals with metal shaving, swarf by the tonne engage an occupational hygienist?
Yes, is a simple answer.
Why am I surprised by that?
I can give you my number. But in reality, it's going to come down to looking and doing a risk assessment. If all your controls are being managed and you've got all that happening, swarf and that, there's probably more safety issues associated with that than probably occupational hygiene issues. But in saying that, there's lead, there's noise, there's a whole heap of other things we haven't even touched on today. Ergonomic issues that may be of concern for that. So at least get them in to do what we call the OHH review to have a look at what the risks are, and they can quantify those risks a bit, put them into a bit of an order order for the business to start working through and chip away at the high risk ones that need to be managed appropriately first. But simple answer is yes.
All right, last question. You ready for it? It's a bit technical here, and I failed science as a kid at school, so if I don't get the pronunciation of this right, I apologise early. From Dorinda, our last question: are you aware of a dual filter for isocyanates and silica, for example, P2 with charcoal?
Simple answer is yes. There are filters out there that are appropriate for that. A lot of them will work as two separate filters. There'll be a particulate filter which you should have in front of a organic filter for the isocyanates, so that will filter out the silica through the particulate, and then the isocyanates will be coming through on the organic filter. But be also aware that isocyanates do have some skin absorption potential as well, so you'll also need to look at what PPE people are wearing on their hands, depending on the circumstances of what they're dealing with that material. But yes.
Pete, it's been a long time since your presentation. We've had a number of questions, and we thank everybody for joining us for the presentation, and particularly those who've submitted questions. Give us your take-home messages that you really want to drive home here today.
Okay, so the take-home message is there's lots of information out there that is freely available for people to go and look for and find. You just need to ask the questions and start, investigating through the OIR website. It's a really great place to start. You can look up your industry group. You can look up the kind of work that you're doing and break it down that way. So there's so much information out there. When it becomes overwhelming, that's when you reach out and get maybe a specialist of the area to come in and help determine what's going on from there.
Cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation and answering all those tricky questions for us. And thank you for joining us at your workplace or at home today. Before you go and get on with the rest of your day, we'd love to hear your feedback on today's presentation. So please grab your phone and scan the QR code that's on the screen at the moment and take a brief survey. It's short, it's anonymous, and your feedback is used to inform topics and content for future events. This presentation will be available on the WorkSafe website in the coming days. That, of course, is worksafe.qld.gov.au. In the meantime, you can also rewatch the session via today's link if you're keen to catch up or share with colleagues straight away. While you're on our website, check out our full range of case studies, podcasts, speaker recordings, webinars and films to help you take action to improve your workplace health and safety and return to work outcomes. These resources are free to download, so I encourage you to share them with your staff and networks. Thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed our Work Well speaker series for 2024, all part of Safe Work Month, which of course is October every year. Thanks again for watching, and remember, as always, work safe, home safe. See you soon.